All right, we're good to go.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the April 1st, 2024 Barcroft Working Group meeting. Thank you again for participating in this land use review and analysis of the Barcroft Apartments Master Financing and Development Plan. Tonight's topic as well, open spaces and connectors. We look forward to working with designated stakeholders over the next several months to review Jai Lynch's vision for Barcroft in the context of existing county policies and plans. Before we begin tonight's meeting, I want to go over a couple of few logistics. We're holding this as a virtual public meeting tonight, and all participants are joining remotely. To orient people to the virtual environment and cover a few specifics about how tonight's meeting will be run, people will be available to join from the Barcroft Apartments Land Use Analysis webpage on the county's webpage and events calendar. Additionally, there'll be a dial-in option for those who wish to use it. We are joined tonight via telephone connection by one participant, Ms. Dye. If I'll just say now that I'll get to that in a moment. If anyone loses internet connectivity during this evening's meeting, please reconnect with us by phone. Please keep your microphone muted until you're called upon. Turn off sound to any other devices around you to minimize interference. These are tools that are located as icons on your toolbar. If you don't see it on your toolbar, try tapping or clicking in the center of your screen or moving your mouse and it will pop up. If you are not a member of the working group, we ask that you remain on mute with your video off so teams can keep focus on the working group members. When a working group member is called upon to speak, you must unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon that is located on your command bar. The moderator does not have the ability to unmute you. And if you are dialing in by phone, please press *6 to unmute. When you're finished speaking, please remute your microphone. You'll do that also with *6. The meeting chat is for technical assistance only. The chat should not be used for discussion, for public comment, for questions about agenda items, or for requests for more information. And all agenda items must be shared verbally for the record. We're going to try to do a public comment at about 8:45. That's my goal, but it'll be at the end of the meeting. A few additional notes for our designated Barcroft Working Group members. Tonight's conversation is limited to members of the Barcroft Working Group roster. Some stakeholder groups have identified an alternate member, but we ask that each meeting you utilize just one spokesperson for your representative group. While everyone else is invited to join and watch, we want to be mindful that this is a large group with a large task in front of us, and we want to ensure that we use the meeting time efficiently to capture as many perspectives as possible during the allotted time. If members wish to be recognized to speak on an item, please turn on your video and use the raise hand function, making sure that your video feed is on and leaving your microphone muted. I'll use the raised hand and the video as an indicator of who'd like to speak. Once you've been recognized, you may unmute, and once you have completed speaking, please turn your microphone off again. Ms. Dye and anyone else who needs to call in via telephone, before we move to the end of any given issue, I will try to affirmatively reach out to you just in case. But otherwise, in your case, I'll be relying on, since you don't have a hand to raise, I'll be relying on you going on and off mute to indicate that you want to speak. The meeting and tonight's meeting and future meetings of the working group will be recorded and posted to the county's website. And all information associated with tonight's meeting, whether written or spoken, is subject to Freedom of Information Act requirements. To provide the working group staff, Jai Lynch, and ultimately the board with input from the broader community, especially Barcroft residents, communication and engagement staff have launched a public engagement period that was initially running through March 24. It's been extended through April 7. Is that correct, Ms. Sante, Mr. Matuzik? Been extended to be available through April 7. If you have not filled it out, please do so as soon as you can and circulate to your various stakeholder and constituent groups. During the period, county staff will also be attending events at Barcroft to visit the property to invite residents to fill out the form using iPads and answer other questions. The form is brief. It uses plain language. It's available in English and in Spanish, and I believe other languages as well. Transportation is based on 4 land use topics being addressed by the working group. conversation on redevelopment areas, transportation, parking, open spaces, and natural design and urban design. There's also an opportunity as I mentioned, it's in English and Spanish. It's also in Amharic, Arabic, and Vietnamese. And participants can use the translate button to access the form in many additional languages. Staff will analyze the data collected during the engagement period and working group in April. In the meantime, we ask you to share the link again with people who you know. Again, tonight's meeting will focus on open spaces and natural areas. The staff have prepared a preservation to help orient everyone to the site and existing policy, which informs the vision. Afterwards, the applicant team is also going to give a presentation, and then we'll move on to discussion. Before that, those presentations begin, I want to remind people that we'll use the same format that we did for the last couple meetings, which if anyone here is on the meeting for the first time, please raise your hand in Teams and to introduce yourself. Otherwise, when we get to discussion, and I will try to remind people, but for at least the first or second time that you speak for the record, just again remind us of who you are and your affiliation. And because I forgot to do that, my name is Daniel Weir, and I am affiliated with the Planning Commission and the Form-Based Code Area Working Group. I believe then that the next item on the agenda would be to go over to Ms. Sontag and Mr. Matuzik for the staff presentation. Mr. Matuzik, your camera is on, so I will go to you.
Thanks, Daniel, and good evening, everybody. Myself and Olivia Sontag are going to cover the staff presentation and hopefully provide everybody with some helpful background on this process, where we are in the broader context, and specifically the focus for tonight's conversation, which is open space, and make sure we get some good feedback from everybody that's been able to follow along. So before we get into the details, we do have some updates on the broader community engagement schedule. We'll highlight that in a second. The way we like to group things is have county staff like myself and Olivia focus more on the policy context and really explain some of the adopted plans and policies that are guiding our review of the Giles Lynch's proposal for Barcroft. And as we identify different things that we believe are relevant and should be considered in this review, we want to make sure we highlight those for you so that you can have a similar background and baseline of information to work from as you consider the presentation from the applicant and where things are being shown and slightly adjusted from our policies. So we'll have that, and then after the applicant's presentation, we'll have a discussion, as Daniel just noted. So one of the things we continue to update is really this first half of 2024. You've seen this graphic at other meetings. We continue to highlight the progress that we're making from month to month. We are now in our third working group meeting, which is highlighted here. We have another one in 3 weeks. So tonight, the focus is open space. On April 22nd, we're going to be shifting to urban design, kind of the relationship of new buildings to preserved buildings that are there today. What does that look like in terms of transitions and building heights, as well as some other urban design related issues that we think are necessary. After that meeting, we do have an open house that was scheduled for late October. We have now confirmed that that date will be Saturday, April 27th, and it'll be in the first half of the day. Many more details on that will be made available in another few weeks as we get closer, but we did want to just confirm that with everyone that is interested. And really the purpose of that open house is to make sure folks that are not joining us every 3 weeks to have these conversations are still able to preview the same material that we've been looking at, provide some additional feedback, and just be really made aware. So you can see here that schedule gets us into mid-May, which is right now the final working group meeting that we have scheduled. May 13th is really when we've done talking about the major land use components of the Giles Lynch's proposal. And now we're ready to look at any kind of design evolutions based on the feedback we've provided and staff review, but also look at any kind of policy updates that staff has identified necessary based on the changes that are being proposed for Barcroft. So all that information is going to be presented on May 13th. And once we have that conversation, we can then begin to look at the June and July county board hearing dates, where some of
What do you
those
need?
recommendations.
Should be over there.
Somebody's microphone on, I think. So once we have that meeting in mid-May, we can then shift gears to start bringing those recommendations to the Planning Commission, County Board, and some other committees and commissions in June and July. So we'll keep updating this, but did want to briefly touch on some of the updates that are happening as we speak. Specifically to this working group, or expanded working group, I should say, we have looked at several other topics in February and March. I mentioned public open space and natural areas are going to be the focus for tonight. And you can see here how the additional working group meetings are oriented moving forward between now and mid-May. So Olivia and I are going to cover the adopted policy context that I just mentioned. And I'm going to start with the two more specific documents that provide a lot of detail for Barcroft. And those were done intentionally with the Columbia Pike corridor in mind. And Olivia is going to cover some of the other policy contexts that might be established at a higher level with countywide recommendations, but ones which in many cases do impact and provide intent for what we want to see here at Barcroft Apartments. So in totality, you can see here we've been covering a lot of different previous plans and policies. We continue to highlight the ones that are relevant for tonight's meeting just to kind of keep track and maintain order. Those first two you can see up top, again, where we have greater detail that was developed with the community in mind and with some consultant assistance, but what we want to see with Barcroft moving forward. So looking first at the Columbia Pike Initiative, again, this was the earlier plan from 2002 and later updated in 2005. This was the one that focused on those commercial nodes. And in this case, particularly looking at the George Mason intersection with Columbia Pike and the Fulmar Run intersection with Columbia Pike, and how do those two commercial nodes could establish some interesting corner dynamics on this larger residential property. So this was something that also accounted for other portions of Barcroft. But as it relates to open space, there weren't too many recommendations about significant change because a lot of the open space amenities and assets were really located away from Columbia Pike. So the few instances where we could find that and wanted to share with you all are provided on the screen here, largely looking at the bicycle trails and some additional opportunities along George Mason Drive where existing public park space amenities are already in place. Where we do get into some additional detail in terms of future guidance is in the other Columbia Pike neighborhood plan, which was done in 2012. And in here, one of the better exhibits that illustrates this is the one that focused on both public and private open space opportunities. And it's a quite busy graphic, and it tries to both combine existing conditions, but also some planned or future opportunities. But what we try to highlight here is kind of how this exhibit, in other language, try to identify opportunities for natural preserve areas where significant tree canopy existed, but also opportunities for future public parks that will be accessible to both Barcroft residents and members of the community nearby. So these are the type of documents that we are revisiting as we look at Jaya Lynch's proposal to see whether or not the proposal needs to evolve to match this vision, or in some cases, perhaps the vision needs to be updated because there's something really either meaningful or beneficial in Jaya Lynch's proposal. And I think as you'll see through these meetings and leading up to May 13th working group meeting, there's going to be a few items in both baskets, if you will, where we're going to see both a mixture of policy changes, but also design updates as we try to make sure that the intent for what we had in Barcroft is being addressed. So I'm going to stop here, and Olivia is going to begin covering the remainder of the policy updates.
Yes, so again, Olivia Sontag with the Planning Division. So I'll be covering the Stormwater Master Plan, the Public Spaces Master Plan, and then the recently updated Urban Forestry and Natural Resources Plan. So starting with the Stormwater Master Plan, it established four main goals, including kind of reducing the potential for stormwater threats, reducing the impacts of existing urban development and redevelopment on streams, and then complying with state and federal regulations for stormwater, water quality, and floodplain management, and then complying with all county ordinances for stormwater management, the Chesapeake Bay preservation, erosion and sediment control, and floodplain management. Next slide. So the Barcroft Apartments property is within the Doctors Branch watershed. It's highlighted there towards the bottom of the map. And this just demonstrates a 2012 capacity analysis that recommended capacity improvements up and downstream of the property, where you can see streams on this map. Staff and the applicant are continuing to study the current conditions and capacity of those specific areas. And we do plan to share some more information at the next meeting when we talk about urban design, but just wanted to highlight this area for you briefly tonight. Next slide. So this portion of the Doctors Branch stream has a required resource protection buffer, which currently has paved parking areas and garden apartment buildings within the buffer. So this really means that redevelopment in these areas is really limited. And at this time, the Jerry Lynch team is only proposing internal renovations in this area. And then shifting over to the public spaces master plan. So the Public Spaces Master Plan doesn't have specific guidance for the parks on the Barcroft Apartments property, but there are several goals that are relevant. The first one being just securing and expanding public spaces that are already envisioned. For example, those two green spaces that Matt highlighted on the neighborhoods area plan. And then utilizing level of service as a planning tool to manage those spaces, protecting, restoring, and expanding natural resources and trees, which we'll talk about on some of the next slides. And then it also includes design guidelines for Arlington County's privately owned public spaces. And then shifting to the Forestry and Natural Resources Plan, which was just updated in 2023. It emphasizes a 40% tree canopy target. So some of this is reestablishing and maintaining 40% tree canopy countywide through conservation, tree planting programs, and just tailoring it to kind of specific types of areas on these properties. Also monitoring, ensuring adequate care of significant trees on designated historic sites or trees that have intrinsic historical significance. Directing resources to neighborhoods underserved by existing tree canopy. And then again, this also includes an appendix with the county's draft native plant and maintenance standards. Next slide. So the FNRP also highlights some biophilic design considerations that should be contemplated. It emphasizes it, to be considered early in the design process, and then to include some of that direct integration and experience of nature in those spaces. And the next slide. So moving on to the rationale for some of these changes. The applicant's presentation is going to cover what's being proposed for the sites, but these next two slides will explain some of the considerations for those changes, and then we can revisit some of this information following the applicant presentation. But for the future public spaces, these are just some of the initial considerations that staff have begun highlighting. So you can see here the current proposal, which includes two new public spaces, one along South 4 Mile Run Drive, and then another one along South George Mason Drive. As you'll see in the applicant presentation, these each have been kind of relocated and reconfigured from the previously envisioned locations, and they'll speak to some of the justification for that. These are more public facing now, but they are constrained by kind of the proposed redevelopment areas surrounding. And then given the scale of that future redevelopment and the growing needs for parks in this area, both park locations, staff is saying should be considered for expansion by either relocating existing planned buildings or reducing overall building footprint to give those a little more breathing room. We're also asking that considerations be given to ensuring both spaces are easily accessed within the context of the site's pedestrian bicycle networks, which we looked at last week. And we can pull some of that information up again if needed. And then looking at both spaces to identify any ways we can also integrate adjacent public trails to improve visibility. And then the last slide that we have tonight is again just looking at the overall kind of 40% tree canopy goals for the site. Breaking down these goals a little bit, there are different targets for different areas of the site. For historic preservation areas, we're looking at targets of 50% tree canopy. For new development, 25%. For those programmed mini parks on the east and west nodes, 40% tree canopy. And then for the preserved natural areas, an 80% tree canopy. With that, I think the applicant has a presentation, so we'll go ahead and hand it over.
Thanks, Mr. Matuzik, Ms. Sontag. Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Lauren Riley with Walsh Colucci, and I, along with Kathy Puskar, represent Gyre Lynch Real Estate Partners. We've got a few other members of our team here tonight who will be presenting in just a moment. We've got David Hildy with Gyre Lynch. We have Christian Clary with Perkins Eastman and Jeff Krebs with FICA. If we could jump to the agenda, David. Staff just gave you all a high-level overview of the open space recommendations for Barcroft, those high-level policy recommendations. And tonight we'll be giving you a similar high-level overview of those different elements of open space within our site and the overall proposals that compares to that current policy guidance. So we'll start with our concept and then dive into that open space framework, site topography, which influences our open space program and some of our decisions there. And then lastly, we'll hit on the preserved natural areas within Barcroft, as well as some of those enhancements of courtyards for those existing buildings to remain. Next slide. And then we'll start here with, kind of the slide that we start almost every presentation with here, this concept diagram. And we get new information each time we layer on another element here. And then so just to reorient you all quickly, Columbia Pike here is on your left, 4 Mile Run is on the bottom of the screen there, and then South George Mason Drive is on the top. And speaking of those existing buildings and open spaces within Barcroft, one of the really the beauty and unique, I would go back one more, David. The beauty of Barcroft and something that makes it so unique is how much open space there is today. These apartments are all part of that Garden City movement. They have large, expansive courtyards, grassy areas, lots of trees throughout. And so you'll see moving forward that we are going to be enhancing each of those courtyards with the existing buildings to remain. And then we're also going to add on to that and build some new public open space within these nodes. And coming back to these nodes here, George Mason Place, Wakefield Place, and then Barcroft Crossing and Amenity Center in the middle of the site. These are what are weaving together that new construction into the fabric of the existing Barcroft that will remain. And as we discussed last time, you've got 12th Street being our main east-west connection through the site that's really anchored there by George Mason Place and Wakefield Place. And then in the center, you come to our Barcroft Crossing, which will have our new amenity center and is along that kind of north-south spine of South Thomas Street. Next slide. Here, our starting point comparing the form-based code to our current proposed program. On the left-hand side, you'll see the form-based code recommendations for public open space on the site. The form-based code is, may know, was adopted in 2013. It's got several different types of parks that it recommends throughout Columbia Pike. And then in this instance for Barcroft, it recommends 2 new public open spaces called mini parks here. And then in addition to that existing open space that will remain on the site. And then on the right, you can see our proposed plan, which takes those two more inward facing mini parks and it brings them out to those main development nodes. On the top, we're moving that mini park right there to the corner of South George Mason Drive and Columbia Pike within that George Mason Place node. And then further down, kind of Page South, near 4 Mile Run, we're taking that long, skinny mini park out of kind of the middle of the site and bringing it to that main node of activity on the western side at Wakefield Place. I'll also note, and Christian can elaborate in a moment, that these the locations for these open spaces also take into account the steep topography across the site. And then with that, I think I'll now hand it over to Christian to walk you through our principles and our rest of our proposed program. Oh, Christian, I think you're on mute.
It's too bad. I just said the most brilliant thing I've ever said. I don't know that I could repeat it. All right, all I said was it's very nice to be here. Thank you for having me. What I'd like to do is now walk us through the design principles and then how those principles apply to our design thinking for the open spaces. So we like to think of design principles first before we start to really even conceive of something. And what those principles allow us to do is go back to core ideas that help to clarify our thinking. And so our four primary open space and biophilic design principles are as follows. Number one is the new open spaces and parks that we want to create have to complement the existing parks and open spaces. So they don't exist on their own. They're part of a larger network. Another thing we consider a core design principle is that we want to integrate the public network of streets and sidewalks with the shared use paths and the new open spaces. So it's important that the new designs integrate seamlessly into the existing framework of Barcroft. We also want to provide open spaces for different users. There are two primary users of the site. One is the Barcroft residents themselves, for which the amenity center will be the focus. And then there's also residents in surrounding neighborhoods that could use the periphery parks and open spaces. So we have to consider them as well. And then we wanted to clarify our green space types. There's really kind of three ways in which we could think of it. One of it is usable green spaces. So that's like passive green space that is available for a variety of uses. One is hardscape plazas, where you might use for dining or how you might use a European piazza. And then one is what are called mini parks in accordance with that definition, which is in the form-based code, which we also have in our proposal. Okay, next. Okay, so I want to start first of all talking about the topography of the site. I'm sure you're familiar with this, with the topography of the site, but it's important for this discussion to review it because it's significant. It's a significant factor in how we think about this. We have our two nodes. Remember, we're rotated 90 degrees so we can get more of the site on the piece of paper. So on the left side, what looks north-south is actually Columbia Pike, and then George Mason is at the top, and then 4 Mile Run is forming the other leg of that triangle. Okay, so we have our two nodes in the northeast corner, which is at the top left in this drawing. And then we have the southwestern node, which is in the lower left part of this corner of this drawing. Okay, and you can see the black numbers refer to the topography, the level of the land above sea level. Okay, so we range from a high point of about 200 feet to a low point of about 112 feet. And you can see that those are quite close. And so we're talking about 90 feet of topography change within a very, very tight space, okay? And that happens throughout the site. So then if we could go to the next portion of this drawing. One of the things that is striking about the site is that there really is sort of a plateau that we're referring to as the Thomas Street Plateau. Now, if just in case you don't know how to read a topography drawing, the closer those lines are together, the steeper the slope. Okay, so you can see at the edges of that yellow zone that we've outlined, you can see that the lines get very close together. So that denotes really a very fast drop off. And there's lots of parts of the site that have significant topography. Okay, next. That topography is defined by Doctors Run Valley, which is Doctor's Run, which is a creek, and a park that's associated with it. And the other one is the 4 Mile Run Valley, another creek. So this is kind of like a prow almost between two creeks, two valleys. Okay, and this is up on top of the valley. I mean, not on top of the valley, on top of the ridge that defines those two valleys. It's a very interesting site. Okay, next. And then we have what we're referring to as the historic linear greenway. Now, the historic linear greenway is South Thomas Street, more or less, and South Thomas Street as it goes from Columbia Pike to 4 Mile Run. And you can see that the first 3/4 of South Thomas Street are actually more or less flat. It goes from 196, 198 to 200 over a significant distance. So you don't notice the topography change, but you also notice that right after that, it goes from 200 to 125 in a rather short distance. So that's 75 feet of grade change in a very short distance. So this is affecting how we think about our open spaces with our proposal. Okay. All right, so we're going to zoom into the east node, which we're calling George Mason Place now to review the topography again. This is part of that same drawing we just saw, but zoomed into that corner. Now you can see at the intersection of Columbia Pike and George Mason, it's at 150 feet above sea level, and then it goes down to 130 feet above sea level at the intersection of 12. Okay, and so what we're going to look at is we're going to be looking at a public open space that negotiates this 20-foot difference. Okay, next. And so what we see here is, I believe this is a 0.7 acre open space. Now that 0.7 acres, for the record, is measured from the edge of the building to the back of the sidewalk along South George Mason. Okay, so that's when we say 0.7 acres, that shaft of space that you see there, that's what we're talking about from the back of the sidewalk to the face of the building. Okay, now this isn't designed yet, but within this space, we envision that you could have dining and retail areas, which would constitute some hardscape, and a public terrace, which would also be some hardscape. You may have been to parks that have public terraces. Bethesda Terrace in Central Park is one of the most famous in our country. It doesn't feel like it's not a park, but it is a hardscape area. And then we also have a terraced green because there is significant topography. So a terrace would be green, occupiable, usable. That terrace is down the slope in two directions to make up that grade. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here. And it also is intended to connect Centro, which is just to the left of this drawing, and Doctor's Run Park to start to create a network of open spaces that are accessible to the community at large. Okay, not just this is for the residents, but it's also for the rest of the community. Again, as Lauren said, which is why it's located on the exterior of the site. Okay, next. Then we move to the historic linear greenway and resident amenity center, which we're also referring to as the central node. Now, this the only thing that's going to be new on this site, if we go to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, I have to talk about the topography. Again, as I said earlier, it's relatively flat for its first 3/4, and then it drops off significantly. And here you can see the topography lines getting very close together, which denotes a rather steep slope. Okay, so the area where it says 200 feet, you can see that the lines are rather far apart, which means it's rather flat. So that's an important thing to consider when you see the next slide. So when we see this next slide, the area that had that flat area is where we are currently showing the resident amenity center. Now that resident amenity center, again, not yet designed, but what we imagine would be in there would be things like several multi-purpose rooms. You can see a multi-purpose room in the upper right photograph here being used. Could be used for meetings like this or other things. Certainly a fitness center, a lounge for residents. Other outdoor amenities in that quad that it makes, and also on the space between the building and the street. Now, another thing, it would have a leasing center. Now, what's important about having a building like this here is currently there's no indoor or outdoor space that's specifically located for the use of the residents for community activities. There are the public courtyards that stretch along South Thomas Street and all the other courtyards and all the other buildings to remain, but there isn't a place that really forms like the community center for the people at Barcroft, and that is what we're envisioning for the resident amenities center. Okay, along that spine, this is also, remember, along that plateau that I described, would be restored courtyards for each of the buildings to remain. And what this could do is this could actually make quite a remarkable series of public spaces for the residents of the community. And what you see, the photograph there in the bottom right, again, this is a precedent image. This is from a development of a similar era in Pittsburgh. What you see are these really lush, beautiful, rather simple, multi-purpose, usable, passive open spaces that are accessible to all the residents that string along South Thomas Street in this particular case. So we're envisioning this as really the historic heart of the community, with all these buildings being preserved, except for the one that we would need to take down for the amenities center, okay, which is a very small one. Next image, please. And here is a view of South Thomas Street. Now, this is actually taken from a photograph that I took. So this is really what it looks like, is in particular the buildings and the canopy trees. Now, what's different about this, when we think about renovating this, is we're talking about plantings at the bases of buildings. We're talking about perimeter plantings that help to define the edge between the public sidewalk and the lawn or garden in front of the buildings. And we're also talking about understory planting, so fruit trees, flowering trees, new street trees, that sort of thing. And these kind of things go a long way. In particular, the idea of defining the edge between a sidewalk and an open space. Right now, if you were to go there, you would see that those perimeter plantings aren't there, and so the space feels rather ill-defined. But once the edge is defined, even with some low plantings like you see here, the way that space is used becomes much different. It becomes much more for the people that live there in the community rather than people passing through. It's a psychological thing, but it's an important distinction. Okay, next slide, please. All right, this brings us to Wakefield Place, or the west node. Now, with Wakefield Place, the topography around here isn't quite as severe as you'd see in the other parts, but there is a 20-foot drop-off along South Wakefield Street from 150 to 130. The area of the site along 4 Mile Run in this particular 4 Mile Drive is more or less flat. It goes up 3 feet, but again, it's not significant enough change where you really notice it walking. But there is a lot of change between Columbia Pike to 4 Mile Run along South Wakefield. So that's an important consideration when we're talking about locating a public open space. Okay, so what we have here is we're showing a site that's about 1/3 of an acre that we would imagine the potential program of this would be perhaps a playground and general passive public green space. There would have to be probably a single terrace along the middle to make 2 flat usable places, because this does drop about 9 feet from the north part of the site to the south part of the park. Now that 9 feet, it's one of the flatter areas that we could find to locate this park rather close to the mini park that was included in the form-based code, which is why we located it here. But again, because of the topography, to make it usable and horizontal flat, we would need another terrace in there. So there would be ramps and stairs. The sidewalk would be ramped, and there might be a set of public stairs in the park. So it wouldn't be entirely green, but it would be as usable, flat, green, open, passive space as we could manage. And those kind of things often make parks rather interesting. And you see a precedent image there on the left of a passive public open space that can be used in any way that the residents see fit. Okay, next. I think I'm done. I think we're going to pass it off to Micah. Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to go on mute.
I'm going to jump in real quick here before I send it to Jeff, just to talk a little bit about the preserved natural areas that are recommended in the form-based code. So on your left, again, that's the existing form-based code recommendation. And where you see in kind of that darker green color are areas that are preserved natural areas meant to be kind of preserved natural trees and shrubs and ecosystems there within the Barcroft site. And then there are 2 kind of areas of conflict that we did want to point out. That area that's hatched in purple, there is inherently in conflict with the form-based code, which envisions redevelopment in that area. And then that small triangle there, just to the north of that, is a tree preservation area that we will be able to maintain with the proposed program. And then another conflict to point out is that since 2013, when this plan was adopted, there's been an impact, a natural impact to to one of those areas there on the right. You can see the green striped area. Unfortunately, a lot of that was removed with a landslide a few years ago and no longer exists today. So that's been removed from the existing preserved natural areas on the site. And as we move forward, the areas that we are showing in green on the right is our proposed plan, what we are able to provide. We will continue to look at some other opportunities within the site to keep as preserved natural areas, and we will be able to provide you with an update on that as we move through the process. And then with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jeff to talk a little bit about those existing courtyards and enhancements that we'll be doing for those existing buildings to remain.
Thank you, Lauren. Good evening, everyone. I am Jeff Krebs. Excuse me. I'm the Director of Landscape Architecture at VICA. And I'm going to just sort of build upon the framework that's already been established to talk a little bit about, as Lauren said, sort of how we're going to deal with primarily with the neighborhood sort of conservation area. And what you're seeing, broadly speaking, on the screen is, as has been discussed quite a bit already, there's a significant amount of existing open space within this development. It is one of the things that defines Barcroft. It's wide open at the pedestrian level with a very lush canopy overhead in most places. So what we're trying to do, we sort of have two goals for these existing courtyard areas and existing open spaces, and one of them being to restore them, right? They've been around for a long time. Some of them have been maintained better than others over the years. So one of our goals is to restore this natural landscape. We can do that by addressing stormwater, meaning helping to reduce erosion, to capture some of that stormwater, to help keep the soils healthier on site. We can supplement with planting at the bases of the buildings, at the back of the sidewalk, as was discussed by Christian a couple of slides back, to help, again, to begin to define some of those areas. And we can even begin to do something as simple as restore some of the lawn areas. So that begins to pull the site back to life. And then in addition to that, so we're restoring the ground plane, restoring the landscape. We're also going to be enhancing it, right? So we will, as we go through the process, we will be installing new trees at various levels, canopy trees, understory trees, ground plane material, and also providing, so there are a couple things going on, as you can imagine. There are what you see on the screen, the orange dots, represent two things. So the bright orange dots are areas where we're currently going through the 4.1.2 process, use permit process, and we are addressing the needs of that particular building or collection of buildings. And so we're providing at a local level, small little amenity areas for that building, right? So it's a place for to commune, to perhaps cook a meal, have a little gathering. It's just some place that's very unique to that particular building. So right now, it's sort of wide open and there's nothing defined. So as we come through with each use permit, we have the opportunity to provide a small amenity area, and that's what those orange dots represent. The sort of reddish colored ones are for future phases. So they're imagined as potential places for future, again, sort of building-centric small amenity areas that serve that local, if you will, community. So next slide. So this is an example. We can kind of go through these fairly quickly. As I mentioned, as we go through the use permit process for each phase of the neighborhood conservation area, that's when the opportunity exists for us to present a small design. In this case, it's a small sort of a deck overlook area that's tucked in underneath the existing canopy. And of course, this is reviewed, and this is how this particular kind of amenity area would get implemented going forward. So each use permit gets reviewed, gets approved, and then we would move to a construction document phase where this becomes, which is also reviewed. But so we'll just click through these very quickly. You'll see they're very similar. They're just small outdoor seating areas, different configurations, but basically providing picnic tables, grills, places for people to hang out, some sort of hardscape base to make it accessible and stable to keep them out of the mud. These are a couple from the second phase. This is a third phase that we're going through. Again, very similar, providing access into a rear courtyard. Most of these are contained sort of in a kind of a private area, if you will, within the buildings to sort of increase that sense of this belongs to, this collection of buildings. There are a couple that are a little more forward facing, but overall, this begins to create, as you saw in the original map, sort of a network of these spaces that feel both public because they're open to anyone who's walking through, but also a bit private relative to those particular buildings. So next slide. And this is sort of a summation of all that we've talked about to this point. There's a lot going on here, but it really boils down to a few things. The sort of primary background green is that existing informal open space. There are the sort of three clumps of bright green in the center, right, are the existing preserved natural areas that are another component of the overall Barcroft feel. Then there are several sort of proposed components. There are the building centric, like within the new development areas, the white buildings, the big white buildings, they've got private courtyards, right, that will help take some of the load off of the rest of Barcroft, right? Those residents will have unique, as you would expect anywhere else on the pike, right? Unique individual building private amenity spaces. So there's that. There are also the big community center, the big sort of magenta dot in the center. That's the community center that Christian spoke to. And then there are also the private, we get the private areas, which are all the dots that we talked about earlier. And then we have the proposed public parks. All of those things together combine to really just sort of highlight how much green and how much open space exists on site, will exist in the future. And now we're at the point where we begin to sort of figure out how to knit all these things together into a cohesive whole so that the new blends with the old and it begins to feel like a real place. And with that, I will stop talking.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everybody. That concludes our presentation for tonight. Our team is here and we're able to answer any questions that you have throughout your discussion.
Thanks, everybody. That was really helpful. I think we appreciate the clarity of how you walked everybody through the different layers of open space throughout that site. I'll hand it over to Daniel.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Matuzik. I want to open the floor first for clarifying questions. Again, I'm just going to ask that people turn your video on and raise your hand to indicate that you want to be recognized. That's what I'm going to be looking for. And just want to get any, again, basic clarifying questions out of the way. Ms. Commissioner Hayes, we'll start with you. And I just also want to remind people to, if it's the first or second time you speak, please just remind us of your name and affiliation.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate that presentation. Caroline Haynes with the Forestry and Natural Resource Commission. I just want clarifying, just to clarify on slide 14 of the applicant presentation on the conflict areas that were noted on the preserved areas, if we could look at that for a second. There's in particular, also I want to commend the applicant for getting those topo lines in there. That's really important because I think that is absolutely critical to this discussion. Yeah, thank you. So the two areas, one that where the landslide was too, I just want to get a sense of, is that it's still there. Something needs to happen there. So I'm just curious what's the plan is for that, as well as the 0.62 acres. And, that really got skinnied down quite a bit. And that would be definitely a loss of trees in there. So I'm just, if I could get a little more clarification on those two things, please.
Sure. Thank you, Ms. Haynes. I'll start with the 0.62 acres there that was in the purple. That was in the purple hatch. That is an area that is in conflict with the form-based code recommendations itself, which do recommend redevelopment in that area, which is why it's shown to be removed. And then on the landslide area there on your right in the green hatch, a portion of that, I think, as you can see where it says 0.39 acres, portion of that we are going to be able to recover and keep as preserved natural area. Another portion of it will have to be used for grading to negotiate that very steep hill between those buildings on the left as they drop down across that hillside. And then Jeff, I know you're on if you want to provide any other clarifications for what's going on in that hill. I know we've got plans that are currently under review by staff for working on that area.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing, is that particular area is being addressed on its own via its own permit review process. So there is a geotechnical consultant involved who's designing how to restabilize that hill. It has been moving even very recently with the additional moisture that we've gotten. So it's an area that's currently under study. It's still under movement. And so we are waiting for a final geotechnical design that will provide us with something to go forward with in terms of how we replant and what we do with that. So it's ongoing, but it is under review by both us and county staff.
Do you have a sense of the timing on that one at all?
We're hoping to have a geotechnical something in the next couple of weeks, maybe a final design. We had a preliminary design. It shifted some more and it widened. So we have a new design that we're waiting for. So I would say in the next few weeks, let's put it that way. We would hope to get a design that we can then perhaps cobble together a proposal to how to sort of stabilize everything.
Okay, great, thank you.
And then real quick, I'll just reiterate too that while we are losing some of those spaces there, we are going to continue to study and see if there are any other areas in the site that we can use to be preserved natural areas. So we are looking to increase that area.
Ms. Riley, am I correct in understanding the point that you made that 0.62 acres that Commissioner Haynes was asking about, that the western most of the which slide is I'm on my own records? I'm sorry. Yeah, thanks. Could you please? Am I understanding you correctly that 0.62 acres is already? Did I hear you say that is already envisioned in the form-based code for development? Is that what I heard you say? And did I hear you say that correctly?
It looks in the code, that area is shown, it's outlined in green as a preserved natural area, but it's also shown as a blue adjacent to conservation area, which is permitted to be redeveloped. So there's clearly a conflict there in the form-based code itself. And in order to fit a building here, we need to use that area.
So you've identified a tension within the form-based code for how that specific area is handled. Okay.
Yes, those two images aren't saying the same thing, essentially, for what's supposed to be preserved and what's supposed to be redeveloped.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for helping me better wind my head around that. I'm going to go to Mr. McCullough.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Yes, I had a question on the other end of the site, George Mason Place. We have seen that sort of thin little bar, and I've been trying to imagine that since I first saw it. And you talked about it differently tonight than I was imagining. So my question is whether the building that is contemplated for that site includes significant commercial space that could use those dining areas. Is it akin to Chantro across the street, or I was imagining that was 100% residential building, but perhaps that's not correct from the, and I don't know what the program is and what the form-based code says. So that's my question.
Yeah, I can answer that. Our goal would be at least a portion of that to be a potential commercial area. Again, we haven't designed it in detail, but that is one thing that we are exploring, is the potential for retail that would face that open space and be able to participate in that.
Yes, but the program, the form-based code does allow that?
Yes, yeah, I think these street types here do allow, but if Matt, if I'm wrong, or Laura, if I'm wrong, let me know. But I think currently it does call for it there.
Yeah, I think there, I would imagine throughout tonight, there are two different questions embedded in what you just mentioned. First is the use permitted within the building? The answer is yes. I think what we tried to do is have concentrate retail along that entire intersection, essentially every corner. This would be the only one that's in the kind of neighborhoods form-based code section, the more residential aspect of the intersection, but still have some retail opportunities. Where I think the second question is if we are going to have commercial uses, what is their relationship with the open space, and how much of the open space is essentially reserved or dedicated towards those support functions like outdoor seating, like passageways that are associated with the commercial use, and how much of what's left is actually usable public space, park purposes that we want to count. And that's something that we're getting into as we learn more about the proposal.
Okay, thanks. And by the way, I forgot to introduce myself. Yes, Glenn McCullough, representing Barcroft School and Civic League across the street. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCullough. Commissioner Haynes, we'll go back to you.
Sorry, that just triggered another question on the George Mason. So then that 0.7 acres is not, that's not really 0.7 acres, the way we're looking at it from a commercial point of view. As far as a park is concerned, Matt, you said that's still under discussion, right? So that number is not something we should be taking too seriously right now if it's more focused on commercial support.
I think we're in the discovery stage, but it is an element of something we want to pin down in another month or two, because again, we're going back to where we are in this first half of the year. Where we want to be in terms of public open space is to be very firm about where it is located and generally how it is configured spatially, such that in the second half of the year, we can make the next leap and at least start to order and categorize the public spaces that are called for on this site as either being more on the public mini park, more greener atmosphere, or more on the public plaza, more hardscape atmosphere. And once we have that information, then we could be ready for an actual application to come in with redevelopment adjacent to one of those spaces, at which point we could do some more detailed programming of the space. So kind of like 3 different decision points, but between now and June, where we really need to end up is how big are these spaces to count as public parks that will be outside of those commercial zones of support, and therefore we can kind of establish those boundaries before we can begin the next decision point.
Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification.
We'll go to, it's on the screen as Nelson Dimter. Please, give us your name and affiliation. Then Marco, I think that you're up. You've got your, I don't know if you've got your hand up, but your camera is on. So I'm going to go to you after Mr. Dimter.
Yep. Hi, good evening. How you doing, gentlemen? And I know you guys know me already. I live in the complex myself, and I've been representing voluntarily the community. And basically, I guess everything is clear. The only concern that we still have right now as we go with the implementations and the things that you guys have planned out is that the big issue that we're facing is the parking and the towing. It's a big dilemma right now. But I understand the new project has different parking spaces advocated for the residents on the ground, maybe, or maybe on the streets. I think we would like to have more clarification on that, but as we go, because it's going to take a while, the process of starting the building, the new buildings and demolitions in the property as we live. We currently living here, we're facing a lot of parking spots situations, signs missing, and I would like to, you guys, if you could take care of that as we've been waiting patiently over and over these few months of having our meetings every month, once a year. We will have every 4th of every month, basically. And then you guys give us more support in that aspect. You know, we are basically counting on moving new facilities, keep living in this area. We like what we have here. But the towing they've been very nice. They're having not very cooperative. They think towing cars from the streets. And it's a major concern that as we go, imagine when the construction site is going to start coming on sites. Will be trailers, trucks, dumpsters. Where are we going to park? And who's going to take care of that matter overnight? When we go out there, our cars are gone. The towing are taking care of vehicles, even though we have parking decals. And there's no clear parking spaces on the street, county. I've been going through the policies in the county. It's all generic. There's nothing marked. There's nothing specific. And I see that you guys are doing a very good job presenting all this document in there that says specific stuff that we would like to implement as we move now to help us to be more like a peace of mind living here. And we don't have to have this hostile thing, confrontation with the towing car management. Because so I have to think every weekend, my car's going to be out there. Am I going to be towed? I mean, something has to come up, I respect all your professionalism. I respect everything you guys been doing. It's been many years of effort of building this new era of Barcroft apartments. And I love living here, but I guess some residents are very concerned about that. And obviously they want to stay here, but the extra money that we pay for the towing to get our trucks back or cars back is like we don't have that in our budget right now.
Hey, Marco, no, I appreciate the feedback. I'm going to try to do two things: address what you just mentioned, but also put it into context. I think the solution to what you're describing involves several different elements, whether it's signage, so everybody's clear of what the rules are, right, for parking and the towing enforcement. I think restriping both on public streets and within the private property to make it clear, right, where the cars are over any kind of line, triggering a potential call for towing. But I think the parking supply really and management plan is something that we do plan to highlight when we come back in mid-May with some further recommendations and evolutions of the Gyro Lynch proposal. Transportation and parking were discussed at our last meeting in March. So I think we took some helpful feedback at that point, as well as Gyro Lynch collecting a lot of feedback from the resident council and other opportunities. So I think there's some things in the works we want to, certainly propose in another month or so, but we definitely want to focus tonight on open space and make sure we get some of that feedback as well. Appreciate the patience. I know it's a very delicate topic and people are being impacted.
Thank you, Mr. Luna, and Mr. Dipter, thank you for your indulgence. I'll go back to you.
Yeah, of course. No problem. Hi, everyone. I'm Nelson Dimter. I'm here on behalf of the Park and Recreation Commission. And I just had a quick clarifying question here after reading through the presentations and hearing a lot of the sort of the live details. It was very clarifying. So thank you, both teams, for sharing that. I guess my one question right now is just overall, there's going to be increase in density in the area. There's going to be a lot of larger new buildings put in. And I was across the presentation still wondering, like, what is the approximate net change, increase, decrease, if there's anything more detailed there on like just the overall change in green space and in open space. It looks like it's probably going to be going down a little bit across the entire property, but would just be great to understand sort of that directional impact.
Sure. David, if you could put up that last summary slide real quick, maybe a couple of things to point out. Let's see. Give it just a second. Thanks. So in terms of when we talk about public open space, those mini parks recommended in the form-based code, right now we're 1-for-1 replacement of 1 acre public open space recommended in the form-based code to 1 acre of public open space recommended in our program across those 2 mini parks. And those were in part recommended to accommodate new development, provide new public open spaces for residents and kind of, all across Columbia Pike to enhance that network of open spaces from Centro to Doctor's Run and then, for the Old Dominion trail down south of 4 Mile Run. And then when we talk about the new development, the form-based code requires open space specific to each of these new buildings. So each of these buildings will have their own amenities and their own outdoor open space to serve those residents. And then what we're doing for all the existing residents for all the existing buildings to remain, we're enhancing their existing courtyards by providing additional gathering space, as Jeff mentioned, local to those buildings, and then also constructing this new amenity center for all residents of Barcroft to be able to access, since they're not going to have, the same types of amenities in their buildings as the new construction will. So we have this amenity center here for them to be able to have comparable amenities. And then as far as those preserved natural areas, which I think we covered, we'll have a little bit less of those. But again, we're looking for some other places throughout the site to accommodate some more of those preserved natural areas.
Yeah, I think the county staff presentation, which I think had a graphic with several different targets, where tree canopy for the entire property could have a lot of different concentrations, if you will, where we have a public park, maybe that's a higher concentration, just as if we have a natural preserve area, but maybe the existing buildings have a slightly lower one, and the new construction, which is much more dense and occupies more space, has a slightly lower than from that. But I think between all the different tree canopy targets, what we're trying to get to is the spirit of what was envisioned for Barcroft, and get us close to the numbers that were previously called for. As some of the shifting occurs, and as we learn more about the different challenges with dealing with this much topography and other obstacles, some of which are engineering based, so it's kind of very difficult to navigate around them. They have to be addressed. But we do plan to provide, I think, in mid-May, when we come back with some updates, where we think we might be with the numbers in terms of before and after.
Great, makes sense. Thank you.
I'm going to go to Ms. Siegel, and then mindful of the time, we are going to get into the 4 topical discussion areas that we got from Mr. Matuszek earlier. Ms. Siegel, are you still with us? Mr. Luna, your camera is back on, perhaps. Did you have another question, another clarifying question before we go to the discussion topics?
Oh, no, I'm good. Thank you.
Great. Ms. Siegel, let me know, you may be on mute. Well, you are on mute, Ms. Siegel, so you'll need to unmute yourself and turn your camera on. We'll come back to you if need be. Mr. Matuszek, could I ask you to put your discussion topics back on? The first one, if I remember right, was clarifying questions, and then the next one is future open spaces. Is there anyone who wants to be recognized to make any sort of general comment as to public and private future open spaces? We'll go to Mr. McCullough first, and to kick us off. Mr. McCullough, you're on mute.
Yeah, I turn on my camera. That should turn on the microphone in my mind, but it doesn't. Thank you. Starting from the question I had and the answers, I wanted to make a couple of little comments about the strategy. So in the sort of big picture, what I see compared to the form-based code is that these 2 mini parks have sort of moved to the exterior edges of the site. And that has some advantages and some disadvantages. Advantages of they sort of are open to the larger community, theoretically, along Barcroft, along George Mason, along Columbia Pike, along 4 Mile Run. And that's, I think, a positive. But in a way, that's also a negative, because I think the people who are living in Barcroft apartment development itself kind of lose that sense of having their own public space, right? Their own, and we've talked about a little bit, the amenity, building, that's all good. There's lots of good things. And there are lots of open areas. So I guess my comment would be that by moving them to the exterior edges, it makes the interior courtyards that I think Jeff talked about all the more important. And I just want to reinforce how important it is, I think, that those courtyards really get treated well. The beautiful watercolor that we see with the canopies and layered landscaping, fantastic. That requires both effort and maintenance to maintain. Those are beautiful spaces, and if they could maintain that character, that's fantastic. But really focusing on those interior courtyards in the development itself, I think, is really important, especially once those public parks move to the outside edge. And then I guess the other comment I wanted to make was about the Wakefield, what I think is called Wakefield Place. And that's in the area of the new development, which, as I understand, is going to be obviously taller. I'm not sure. I can't remember if they're 8 or 10 stories. But that character of that space is also going to be kind of urban, right? It's going to be terraced. It's going to be hardscape. It's not going to be open park-like. So I want everyone to understand, I think, that it will be, or acknowledge that it will be kind of a little more urban, more like maybe the spaces down in National Landing, and not to think of it really as an open park. And urban parks, I'm an urbanist. I love urban parks. They're fantastic, but they are not. It is not just wide open green space, right? And then lastly, I think the back on George Mason Place, it's shown as this kind of linear piece that connects, quote unquote, to Doctors Run Park and up to Chantro up there. I just feel like and I know the buildings are not designed, and I know the park is not designed, but I think there's a lot of ways to go to make that really feel like a connector and to really see if that's going to work. I think right now it does. It just feels like a building setback. It doesn't feel like a park to me. And to make that connection, I think it really needs it sort of, in a way, kind of we don't have the slide up, but it kind of turns us back to Chantro, and it's kind of a long reach to get over to the other side of the George Mason for the park. So I really feel like that's got a long ways to go too. So those are my comments, and appreciate the time.
Thank you, Mr. McCullough. Ms. Siegel, I'm going to give you a quick shout out in case you're back with us. Thank you, Ms. Guernsey. I'm seeing the note now from Ms. Guernsey. I'm not seeing your camera come back on, Ms. Siegel. So I will keep trying for you. In the meantime, we're going to go to Commissioner Haynes.
Sorry, I don't mean to be monopolizing this, but I've got a lot of comments on this stuff. So anyway, I appreciate it. I also appreciate the focus on those interior spaces and how important that is going to be. I would second the comments that were just made, that they're not leftover spaces and that it really does need to be done well. And so I appreciate the applicant's attention to all of that. I do hope in the staff presentation focus on some of the forestry and natural resources plan guidelines, especially on some of the native plants that presumably we'll be able to use in this project as well, and get all of those additional co-benefits that you get when you're working with native plants. So I hope we'll be able to do that, especially on some of the the steeper topography, especially on some of those areas we just talked about. I did want to specifically talk about, I would second the comments about that North George Mason Park, because it does not right now feel like that's what it's going to be. So just, we'll watch that as it goes along. But I did want to comment on the Wakefield Park, because that is a really important area, especially in connecting to the bike trail down there. And that is teeny tiny at 0.3 of an acre. I get it that these are mini parks, but that's really a mini park, especially if it's going to have 2 different levels. So at least exploring the option of possibly expanding that, because 0.3 acres is just not much to give that kind of a sense of presence and that connection, I think, to the bike trail there. And that will be all of my comments. Yeah, right now. I'll have more later. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Haynes. Ms. Siegel, quickly give you a chance. If not, we're going to go to Mr. Snyder. Mr. Snyder, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm John Snyder. I'm representing the Columbia Pike Partnership. Three things I'd like to mention as comments on the future open spaces. One is that if it would be great if there were a performance space designated. I understand that the land is very much spoken for different uses, but the public spaces should at the least be easily used as a performance space. The partnership, we use actually the center of Walter Reed Drive as a performance space for the Blues Festival, so it can be done, but it's also helpful if it's designed with that in mind, whether it's a hardscape place or some other open area, that it be designed so that it could accommodate performances from time to time. The idea is that this should be a destination for the broader community, as well as being a really good place for the people who live in the complex. Secondarily, in the same theme, the linear gateways, what I've seen so far looks great in terms of the plantings and public art and other amenities can really make it a pass-through place, that it's a destination just to traverse through. Many of us learned to find good places to walk when walking outside was about the only thing we could do during COVID. And this would be a great opportunity to build places like that. The third one, which is really the most fun, is I think there's an opportunity here, particularly knowing that the current and future Barcroft residents are going to include a lot of children like the neighborhood surrounding. There should be the biggest, most intense, most amazing play structure in Arlington. It should be here. I don't know where to put it on this site. It may be that it belongs in the Doctors Run Park, but there's an opportunity for that. There's certainly the customer base in the young children and, maybe even not so young children, but there's absolutely an opportunity for that, and it should be part of the thinking going forward. That's it. Thanks very much.
Mr. Dimpter, and then I'm going to recognize myself.
Great. Thank you again. I'm with the Park and Recreation Commission. Yeah, I want to echo a lot of the stuff that already been said. I think that the vision and seeing a lot of the renderings and a lot of thoughts that gone into this is like really nice, especially those sort of reimagined and redone courtyards with all the landscaping and all of the plantings and new trees, and just to really define those spaces. I think that that'll be an incredible improvement, and it'll really span the entire property, which is really promising. I do think that the opportunities in those mini parks that others have mentioned, they've been moved out to the sides. They're up against these very large buildings that are getting much larger than what there's now. There's going to be, one of them is very long, probably a lot of pavement, impervious surface. So just keeping those things in mind, that it seems like when this area was originally imagined, and there were these mini parks, that these when I imagined it, would be more green, more open, really resemble like the traditional park, consistent with a lot of the other garden apartment properties. And just seeing where they are now, they've been moved to the outside, like the sun, looking at how that's going to be going, east to west, probably a lot of shadows, maybe not a ton of sunlight based on where these are positioned on the actual property up against large buildings. So just continuing to invest and be really imaginative in those two spaces, or think about maybe other areas they could even go, as opposed to being really pushed out and mixed in with a lot of the newer things that we can't even really picture and that are still in planning today. So I would emphasize that really being imaginative and creative with those spaces, and continuing to think about what they could really become. and not just look like sort of something on the edge of the property. I think really integrating that will be very important moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Dimpter. I had said that I would recognize myself next, but I see that Ms. Siegel is back with us. So Ms. Siegel, I'm going to go to you first. Then I'm going to recognize myself. Then Ms. Dye, if you have anything that you want to add, I'm going to check in with you. Then Mr. Luna, I'm going to go back to you. And then I would like to move on to natural preserve areas and tree canopy, mindful of the time. So Ms. Siegel, take us away.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Just give me a thumbs up.
I can hear you.
Great. Oh, sorry about the technical difficulties. So I'm just actually piping up because I want to support a couple of things that have already been said. I won't harp on it, but I do want to support them. One is the concept of a kick-ass children's playground on this site or very, very close to this site because we all need a place to go with our families and children to play. And play is critical for the health and well-being of children, as well as their parents' sanity. So I want to just really support that idea. I also don't quite know exactly where such a place would be on this site, but I think it's absolutely a missed opportunity not to pay attention to that feedback. And secondly, I just want to jump in and honor and support what Marco said. I realized that the conversation about parking, et cetera, was last week, which I missed. But when a resident and a representative of the residents in a community brings up an issue and feels that it's so critical that they have to bring it up twice or three times, I think we are remiss if we don't really hear that they're saying and pay some attention to it. I know that you mentioned that we are, that you're looking at it, better signage, all that stuff, but please, 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 I don't think there's been a development on the Pike where parking has not been a hot topic for the residents, and I have not seen that honored in every renovation and facility that's been improved along the Pike, and I'd like to at least honor these residents by supporting their request for improved parking. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Siegel. I want to echo some of the things that have been said about the park locations. I want to take the park location a little bit further. As respects the park along 4 Mile Run Drive Minor, the takeaway that I have looking at that map is that I don't really get a sense that I know who it is for. That is not it looks to me like it is for the residents of the two buildings that almost completely surround it and isolate it from the rest of the Barcroft community at large, and that it would be accessed from 4 Mile Run Drive Minor, improvements to which are not, as far as I understand, a significant part of this project, meaning that it is its public facing aspect is probably the most uncomfortable street to traverse in the area, in along the Columbia Pike, along the western part of Columbia Pike. So I don't really know who it's for. It certainly doesn't feel like it's for anyone. The sort of buildings that wall it off from the rest of the community. So I think that there needs to be some revision there. I continue to think that the primary approach to Columbia Pike for the bike path needs to be to Columbia Pike directly, not via 4 Mile Run Minor. And I think that I think that both of those issues need to and should be solved in tandem. Likewise, I also support the playground area. I think that a related challenge is that one of the things that has been heard from the community as well, at least the Residents Council, was a desire for a pool. I am not sure I know how I would suggest to the applicant that they work a pool in, but I can say that the nearest spray grounds in the area are about 2 miles away at closest, and not very accessible, definitely far on the far side of this area. So it would at a minimum be nice to get some kind of water feature in this area. Temperatures aren't going down anytime soon, at least on an annual basis. So I think that is definitely, the sense that there should be a pool. I echo that. Maybe that's not feasible. If it's not feasible, I strongly encourage the applicant from a public spaces perspective to be thinking about alternatives to pools that involve water, and that's, I think, what I have for that. So I'm going to go to Mr. Luna and then Mr. Cole, and then I promise we are going to move on to natural preserve areas and tree canopy. Thank you. Mr. Luna, you may be on mute. You took yourself off of mute and then put yourself back onto mute. There you go.
All right. Thank you one more time for letting me part of this forum tonight. Anyway, so I'm realizing as we speak, I know it's going to be a big construction, big buildings, and this is my second time moving to this area. But if you look at the map on 13th Street South and George Mason, it's a Doctors Run Park. There's a public school, Randolph Elementary. I wonder, do you guys have a plan while construction? How is going to be the traffic flow for this passage from the residence to the school into the park to the residence? Do you guys have any plan idea how to solve that issue? Because this street stops everything. Columbia Pike, it stops 4 Mile Run, George Mason. It's a huge intersection right here between 13th and George Mason. Looking at your plan on the street side, is there like a
Mr. Matusik, I know that we don't have anyone from Mr. Cole. Or Mr. Luna. That's a good question. We don't have anyone here tonight, I don't think, from Department of Environmental Services. Mr. Luna, that's the department of the county staff that typically deals with transit and transportation issues directly. But Mr. Matusik, I don't know if you want to address that very briefly, but I think that we could also, Mr. Luna, get a response to you directly and then get a more detailed response to that question at our next meeting as well. But Mr. Matusik, I defer to you.
Yeah, thanks for that. It is a great question, partly because there's only so much that we know at this point, which is there was an earlier exhibit, I think in our last meeting, maybe the last two, that speaks to a phasing diagram, kind of the order at which the site is anticipated to change, right? Which projects, which buildings might come in first. So that's a beginning preview of what we might want to start strategizing for, not just in terms of safety and access, but construction worker staging or parking, construction staging, the route that trucks may take for deliveries, and getting debris out. So the good news is that as we get closer and have a more refined version of what that order looks like, and specifically within each one of these big phases, which usually include multiple buildings, which one might come in first versus second, that's really when we're going to start to figure out what is acceptable. Because at that point, when we get closer to it, a proposal from the applicant, from John Lynch, will need to be submitted, but then multiple departments on the Arlington County side have to review for acceptance. And only after we identify that it is something we can support can any kind of construction begin. So whether that's the safety issue you just mentioned on George Mason and the Doctors Run Park, or several other ones that are existing throughout the property, those are all going to have to be addressed before any kind of construction can begin. The reason why I think my response, at least, is so limited is because we are nowhere near the start of any new construction, because we have so many other steps ahead of us, the planning of which is going to take us well into next year. So I think we're starting off at a very high level. And I think, as you'll see, if you follow along over the coming months and into next year, we are going to start to get into the more detailed information about, okay, I think we have a full vision of what, this could look like in a few decades, but more imminently, where do we start? What does that look like? And let's start looking at those details. So some of what I think you're looking for is probably going to become more clarified later this year, early next year. I don't know if Jai Lynch has anybody on the call who would like to, add anything else to that response, or that was adequate.
Yeah, I can just more reiterate, Matt, what you said is that, we are looking at this, how these pieces fit together over a long period of time. And those are all considerations that we go into with staff when actual plan submission comes into the county. And, we're committed to, again, communicating throughout this whole process. It's going to be a long process of build out, but making sure that our residents are taken care of and have the information, and that we're accommodating, like you said, Marco, like the crossing there at 13th Street to the park, to the Mill Elementary School, making sure that's always accessible for where people are coming from, make sure there are paths. All of that is, the details that we do get into with plans, and are committed to do that.
Thank you both. Mr. Cole, I'm going to go to you. Mindful of time, remember, I'm going to start public comment a little later than promised, at probably closer to 10 or 5 of. We haven't seen anyone in the chat who says that they'd like to leave public comment. Now would be a good time, if you are here to leave public comment, to indicate so in the chat. But this is going to be our last topic on future open spaces. And Mr. Cole, remember, I asked people to lead with your name and affiliation.
Appreciate the reminder. I wouldn't have done that. Mark Cole, Arlington, Culver Heights neighborhood. And Matt, I promise to be nice tonight. So I guess my sentiments around the mini parks is very much along the same lines as what most everybody's been saying. Those really don't sound or look like parks to me. They look like amenity areas next to larger buildings. So I understand what neighborhood form-based code had in it. I get it. So in my thinking, then what raises is there's plenty of green space within the site. And you talked about those green spaces, and you talked about having the amenity areas. And I think there were 5 of them that were identified as proposed. And I get what that means. And then there were a bunch of other splats. Oh, and by the way, thanks a lot for the pointer. Fantastic. It was great this time. I appreciate that. I told you I was going to be nice, Matt. But going back to the potential amenity areas, my question is this: what does potential mean? I mean, I understand what it means conceptually, but in terms of planning, what does that mean for the community? Does that mean that an amenity area will go in there, or there's just space for it? I don't know what that means in terms of in reality-based world.
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Cole. Jeff and I can take that one. David, if you could bring up that slide with the potential versus proposed amenity areas for those existing courtyards. In terms of the procedure, what it means is those that are in those light orange circles, once we get there, those are ones that are currently proposed or approved with a form-based code use permit. So for example, that number 4 there, that was that courtyard, which was the first rendering that you all saw, that's already been approved through the first renovation phase last year. And so has number 5 there further down to your to the right side of the page. And then those other remaining ones are pending use permits that are currently active in the county system that'll be going to hearing in the next couple of months. And Jeff can speak to the character of these spaces and the potential ones as well. Those are in the red dots are very similar types of courtyards and planned open space that will come when the renovation use permits for those particular buildings come forward. So they will happen just at the same time as those buildings are being renovated. Jeff, I don't know if you wanted to say anything more about that.
Oh, I think you covered it very well. I think the potential word, right, is what triggered the question. And I think what we're trying to say is it may not be exactly in that right location, but it's likely going to be very close, right? So we're trying to build in a little bit of flexibility about where it might actually happen. So hence the word potential. But those are the locations, the general locations that Jair Lynch and the design team have come to feel like would sort of round out the program.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very
much. And those are all
sir.
going to have similar features in terms of seating, and some might have grills and things like that. There'll be more of those kind of interior open spaces for people of those buildings to gather.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dye, and then we're going to Canopy. Ms. Dye, we don't hear you, but we will come back to you after the next tree canopy related question. Is there anyone who wants to be recognized to speak on canopy issues? Commissioner Haynes, funny seeing your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, it's forced to natural resource. If I don't speak up on this one, I'm not doing my job. So
I almost
yes,
said, Commissioner Haynes, will you kick us off with the canopy related issues?
Yes, I'd love to talk about trees all the time. So this, again, this site has just some amazing opportunities to preserve trees. And I realize on some of the areas that are just being renovated and not being torn down, there's still going to be quite a bit of tree impact, especially with some of the utilities and things like that are going on. So I think just to be super mindful of that we've got some just fantastic trees in tree canopy on this site. But then there's also obviously lots of opportunities for additional trees, and presumably the project's going to have to meet those tree canopy targets. So we know that there's lots of trees going in. We also know there's a lot of success now in planting much more densely than what we used to do typically in an urban environment. And what an awesome opportunity in Barcroft to really create places that will be just have those biophilic elements for the residents, and to really use this as an opportunity to not just the tree canopy, but the herbaceous level as well, to really create those spaces that we can try to reconnect nature and do all of the co-benefits, reduce the heat island effect, clean the water, clean the air, try to improve some of the soils, and especially on those preserved natural areas that we know have to be restored. So, especially the ones with the landslide. I mean, it's a pretty cool opportunity there, especially given the topography in some of those other spaces. And we've seen a lot of success in native plantings of steep areas. These places used to all be covered with plants before, it was developed. So I think to really be thinking creatively and how do we maximize those opportunities for the residents to create this really awesome place for them, to continue to live. So just more just a cheerleading effort here to get those trees in and make sure that we are reaching those tree canopy targets as required in the plan. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Haynes. Ms. Dye, I still see that you came off mute, so I want to just check in. I'm not hearing anything. No, thank you. Great. Take us away.
Okay, Linda Dye representing Douglas Park. I just wanted to get some more clarification about the impact of the Doctors Run watershed and riparian area, and how far you have to stay away from the stream itself in order to build. Especially since we did go to the trouble of putting a note on the form-based code saying that we wanted to look for opportunities to daylight Doctor's Branch. So I'd just like a little more information about that southeast corner of the Pike and George Mason, and what limitations might exist in terms of needing to stay away from the run itself, and how much development we can have there. So I'd just like a little more information. If somebody could speak to that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Mr. Matuzik, I'll go to you, and I also saw your hand go up, and perhaps in response to something from Commissioner Haynes. So if you want to do both of those at the same time, and then Ms. Lawrence, we'll get to you after that.
Yeah, a lot of ideas going through my mind. I'll start going backwards from the last comment. Um, there are Doctors Run near the south portion of the property triggers a lot of different issues. Um, some aesthetic, some design related, some infrastructure related. And it's something we're actually actively studying because it almost warrants its own meeting, if you will. There's just so much there to peel back and study and analyze. And I think what we're trying to do is, in the context of everything else that this land use study needs to address and solve for, how do we still implement the vision for Barcroft while addressing what's happening on the southern tip of the property, which is not just impacting the site itself, it's really a collection for the entire branch that flows from other parts of the county, as you've seen in one of the exhibits in our presentation. I think the daylighting effort is something we can get back to you on with some additional staff from different county department, because daylighting, I think, does trigger some additional capacity issues. I think some people might look at it as an opportunity to improve capacity. It does have a very immediate domino effect of, improving it in one area means you have to improve it in other parts based on how the flow works. And I think it also becomes more challenging once you kind of start to analyze the different sections that would be impacted, some of which are privately owned, some might be publicly owned. So I think we're compiling some additional information that we want to return to you all and provide some more clarity on that topic. But it is something that between now and mid-May, we are going to cover and that there's a common understanding of what's happening there and maybe what some of the restrictions are. But knowing what we do know, I think Jar Lynch has been very smart to, I think, really focus the renovations on the interior of the buildings there, because any kind of further encroachment of additional buildings or additional impervious surfaces within that buffer of the stream, I think, does trigger a lot of regulatory elements that I think are just not working towards our ultimate goal. But if there are improvements that we can make and address some of the capacity issues, that's something we are actively exploring.
Okay, thank you very much.
Ms.
One
Lawrence,
other thing.
Sorry. Nope, it's you.
It is me. Apologies. One of the other elements I wanted to come back to with the previous comment, which was in many of the comments that we're looking at and a lot of the reviews of the Jar Lynch's proposal, while we are always returning to those earlier Columbia Pike plans, the exercise that I think staff is conducting behind the scenes and in between these meetings, just for full transparency, if it's not obvious yet, isn't a simple comparison of whether or not we're getting exactly what previous maps were showing. It's a much more nuanced exercise in that, are there better solutions to what needs to happen on this property beyond perhaps what was envisioned in the form-based code or those earlier plans? But more importantly, there have been a lot of county policies that have been adopted since 2005, since 2012, that we are now obligated to implement in this process. So this whole land use review of Jar Lynch's proposal for Barcroft is an interesting opportunity to maybe update what that vision looked like, not just in response to what Jar Lynch has come up with, which is quite interesting, but also in relationship to everything else we've learned since those plans were adopted. So I think a lot of times what might end up happening is we're going to be exceeding in a much more strategic way what those plans for Columbia Pike and Barcroft were showing, which is why I think when you see some updates in mid-May and moving on in June, they may not look like what's currently on the books for Barcroft, because we are now obligated to address many other plans and policies that have been implemented by the county board since that time. I just want to put that out there as folks continue their review and we jump from one topic to another, if it helps provide some further context.
Thank you, Mr. Matusik. That's a really important and well, I think, made point. Ms. Lawrence, and just a reminder to give us your affiliation and name, which I've spoiled, but affiliation would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm having trouble. There we go. Okay. I just want to identify myself with I'm Joan Lawrence from the Historic Affairs and Landmark Review Board. I wanted to identify myself with Commissioner Haynes' comments, and I also wanted to add that we are losing many of the courtyards and many of the trees that are present with the buildings that are being removed for the proposed redevelopment. And so I think that the whole garden apartment open space part that's being preserved, it will be great. But I think that the effect of these taller buildings, and although we haven't really gotten into height, it's a later meeting, is likely to have an impact on the tree canopy, on the open spaces that remain. And I just want to bring that particular point up. I know it's late. I could say other things, but I'll leave it at there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Lawrence. Commissioner Lawrence, do we have anyone who wants to be heard on site-wide amenities issues? I will reiterate my comments and some of the comments that were made about playgrounds and pools that I don't think without inviting people to everyone to reiterate, I think that I'll just point out that a lot of the comments we heard about open space are directly cross applicable to site-wide amenities, and perhaps we'll leave it at that. Mr. Matuzik, you left a comment in the chat. I just want to give you a chance to say it for the record and for anyone who's not following the chat, if you would.
Oh yeah, just briefly, I think Linda Dye's question, a portion of which that I ignored, dealt with the actual dimension of the resource protection area buffer. So one of our colleagues who's on the call indicated that that was a 100-foot distance measured from the center of the stream.
All right. So I'm not seeing any hands for to be recognized for site-wide amenities. I will reiterate again that I don't think that means that there aren't any, that there's no feedback on site-wide amenities. I just think it means that you've already heard a lot of the feedback on site-wide amenities, just and a sort of event overlap with some of the other topics. If there is nothing else, Mr. Matuzik, that you think needs to be addressed either by you or your colleagues or anyone else, I'll check in to see whether or not we have anyone interested in giving public comment. But Mr. Matuzik, first, we're good on anything from your colleagues or any other parties?
I am not seeing anything right now.
All right, great. And then I don't see anyone still who's identified themselves as wanting to provide public comment. We will, I'm going to say going once and twice. So that will conclude our public comment section for the evening. Ms. Sontag or Mr. Matuzik, do you want to just go back to upcoming meetings and significant next steps before we adjourn this evening?
Yeah, just real quick, I'm going to fast forward to the slide near the end. Where are we? There we go. So just a preview of what to expect in 3 weeks when we regroup for another topic-based conversation, which I think will have some overlap from what we heard tonight, but in a more broader context of urban design. Again, relationship of buildings that are delivered to the property to those that are going to remain, the relationship of buildings to open space, connectivity, access. So another interesting conversation, and again, leading us to what will be our final meeting in mid-May on the 13th. And again, between now and then, we'll be advertising some additional reminders about the open house that's scheduled for April 27th, which is a Saturday.
Great. Well, thank you to staff who've been on this evening. Thank you to representatives of the applicants who have been on, and thank you to everyone else from the expanded broader working group and everyone who's been made time to be with us tonight. I think that this has been, at least I certainly hope that this has been a productive meeting, and I think that there's a lot of good feedback that we've gotten, that staff has received as well as the applicant, and that will hopefully move the project forward. So with that said, I'll wish everyone a good evening, and we will all see each other again on the 22nd. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, Daniel. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.